we've just heard isn't all that common in our Gospels. That is, not many places where we have characters with some depth, at least characters who aren't the main actors. It's a treat when in our Gospels we get a bit of extended dialogue. There's a bit more character development. There's a bit more of a story than just simply Jesus healed someone and he was on his way to the next place. We've gotten a bit of that through this Lenten season, and we will still in the weeks to come. Last week we heard it with Nicodemus. This week more of the same with the Samaritan woman. Those two stories, the ones of Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, hold together in some significant ways. There are certainly some similarities between the two, but the places of contrast have the most to say to us. And as we are in the midst of this Lenten season, where we are called to do some of our own character development, these stories are timely. You'll remember last week we talked about Nicodemus, who is the insider's insider, a powerful and affluent leader among the Jewish people. I could imagine the kind of character we would love to have in our pews, someone who might feel comfortable in our pews. This week, the story is different. An unnamed woman, a Samaritan who is an outsider even among outsiders. And yet, Jesus notices her. Jesus had been in Judea before this episode unfolds, but with rising tensions from the religious elites, Jesus decided to leave Judea, take some of the pressure off, and return to Galilee. But between those two destinations lies Samaria, home of people who for many generations had been despised by the Jewish people. Passing through Samaria may have been the shortest route to Galilee, but it was the least desirable one for the Messiah and his followers to take. Nonetheless, Jesus does exactly that, and he leads his disciples through Samaria. As they make their way outside of a Samaritan city, Jesus, who is fatigued by ministry and travel, sat down by a well. As Jesus rests near Jacob's well, a woman, this unnamed woman, comes to the well in the heat of the noontime hours. Now, this was not a common thing for someone to fetch water at that time of day. And it also wasn't common that someone would travel alone to take on this task. For whatever reason, this woman had been excluded from the common life and the networks of safety and fellowship that she would have known if she traveled with those who would come to the well during the cooler hours of the day. But Jesus, this noontime hour, notices her and he strikes up a conversation with her. Forgetting all the lessons that Jesus learned in his clergy, boundary, and ethics trainings, he strikes up a conversation in this precarious moment where his encounter alone with this woman, this Samaritan woman, could threaten his reputation and call his entire ministry into question. Nonetheless, Jesus risks talking to this woman, and just like Nicodemus, though, the two strike up a conversation and they just start talking past one another. This time, though, it isn't confusion about being born again as it had been with Nicodemus. Now it's water, living water, that is the point of confusion. Jesus and the woman go back and forth as the conversation progresses, just like with Nicodemus, Jesus turns the conversation back upon the interlocutor as he instructs her, go get your husband and come back here. Ah, but I don't have a husband. True. And yet that was only part of the story. As Jesus stated the part she didn't. You've had 5, and the man you're now with is not your husband. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if you're honest with yourself, how many of us have made judgments about this woman's moral character? Or her lack thereof? What Jesus has uncovered, what he has seen of this woman, is no indication whatsoever of this woman's failings. In that day and age, we are wise to remember that a woman could not divorce a man. Only a man could divorce a woman. This woman has either been left or her husbands have died. Whatever is the case, or whatever combination of those two things has happened, in that day and time, this woman was left without the protection and the security of having a husband. Jesus was not shaming the woman, and we shouldn't either. Instead, we should see the way that a world that did not have a place for her victimized her, but also the ways that she was a survivor. If we remember last week, by the end of our reading in John chapter 3, Nicodemus had gone silent. You start to wonder if he just walked off as Jesus began a monologue out of the dialogue they had started. However, with this excluded Samaritan woman, the one Jesus noticed, by the end of the story, she is a witness. She is the one who has a voice, and she is the one who carries on the story. If we had kept reading a bit farther, we would have heard as she not only called the people to come and see the one who really sees me, but we would have seen that this excluded woman had a following coming out to meet with Jesus. I hear the story of Jesus and this woman, and I am amazed how the excluded ones gain Jesus' attention. And then they are the ones who seem most suited to carry the good news to new people. I also can't hear this story of this excluded woman, at least not now, without looking mournfully upon what is happening in the state of Iowa, especially as it comes to legislative efforts to exclude and banish LGBTQIA people from our common life. In this current legislative session, we have seen what is happening across this country in record numbers. Here, we've seen 29 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation, including various don't say gay or don't say trans type bills, the removal of gender-affirming health care up to age 18, which, by the way, the medical community is clear on the value of that. We've seen legislation to ban books and so on. Now, not all of that has made it through the funnel week. Some of those pieces are still being debated, and some are waiting for a governor's signature. But let me be clear, all of it is harmful. Joe Allen, a photographer from Des Moines who is non-binary, was quoted in the Gazette this week saying, "It is difficult to live in Iowa, given the legislation under consideration." Joe also said, "Anti-trans bills have nothing to do with privacy, but are focused on expelling trans folks from public life. What is happening victimizes the victims, forcing people to become survivors and making survival for them even more difficult. A 2018 University of Iowa report, transgender Iowans were more likely to have experienced homelessness, been abused, they were less likely to feel safe in their own town, and more likely to experience discrimination in public than cishet men like me. I can almost hear the exclusion as a part of today's story from Samaria. Oh, you can go and drink from the well, but you can do it in the heat of the day. And you will not have the protections or support of the community as you do. But thank God that Jesus has a place in his story for those others would exclude. I'm also grateful that this church has said we want to build a better future than the one that our legislatures have in view right now. I'm also grateful that we have named our commitment to do the work necessary to open ourselves, to be a place of ever increasing welcome and belonging. It's important to notice who Jesus notices. Jesus revealed himself to the Samaritan woman, the consummate outsider. She, not Nicodemus, the insider of insiders, but she was the one who was given the opportunity to look upon the face of a stranger at that well and know him as the Christ. If we'd kept reading, we would have heard, as I mentioned already, the way she went back to the city and brought a following with her. Our faith is a movement that grows when outsiders are noticed and when their voices are heard. As we seek to reflect and prepare in this Lenten season, I want to leave you with a few questions. Who will you notice? Whose stories will you hear and believe? These are Lenten questions, and they are urgent right now because in our situation, the lives and well-being of our excluded neighbors are at risk.